Hi, guys. It's Sunday, February 23rd, 2025, and I have an exciting update for you. The Ocean Infinity search vessel tasked with carrying out the third seabed search for MH370 has just now arrived at the search area. And not only is it in a good position to deploy its underwater robots, its position gives us a solid answer to one of the biggest mysteries hanging over the search, namely, where are they going to look and why? Okay, in the last episode, Ocean Infinity vessel Armada 7806 had left Mauritius and started steaming towards the area in the southern Indian Ocean where the plane is believed to have crashed. Now, a week later, it has arrived after threading its way between some storms and has covered some 2,000 miles of ocean. What we didn't know at the time was where exactly it was going to go because we didn't know what the analytical basis for the search was going to be. Well, now we do. Let me explain. As we've talked about in previous episodes, the SATCOM data that officials use to work out where the plane went doesn't give you a location like GPS does. It doesn't give you latitude and longitude. Instead, it tells you if a given route that you can come up with matches the data or not. So theoretically, there's really an infinite number of routes that you could take into the southern Indian Ocean that would match the data. You could fly straight and fast. You could fly slow in a curve. But if you take all the possible routes and assess them statistically, it turns out that most of them are just very unlikely. And so what you wind up with is a probability distribution that looks like this. By the way, if you want the full context for the search for MH370, including a full 2-season podcast of what happened to the plane, where it could have gone, and why, check out the show page at findingmh370.com. You can get free weekly emails, and if you want to support the podcast financially, you can sign up for a paid subscription, which is very appreciated. Okay, back to the story. The probability distribution is sort of like a fried egg shape that's centered on around 36 degrees south. So this is where the first seabed search was concentrated. This is the one that started late in 2014. It went on until 2017 on and off. Here's a map that Victor Ianello posted on his website. As you can see, they mostly focused on the part of the ocean where the plane would have gone if it had flown straight and fast. That's a very reasonable assumption. That's how jet planes normally fly. They searched pretty far out from the seventh arc, the seventh arc being where the final transmission was sent, and the plane just was not there. It was in none of these locations where you would expect to find it if it had gone straight and fast. They also searched a little bit further north, but they didn't search quite as far away from the seventh arc. They searched a much narrower band. After they did all of this, their thinking was probably that in order to get this far north, the plane would have had to made a series of statistically unlikely turns. And so the probability that it did all that and then also got far from the seventh arc was pretty low. Anyway, that's where they searched, and then they gave up. After they gave up, they put out a final report, and they discussed in that report thinking about where they could have gone wrong. Like where did they fail to look that they should have looked? And they decided that they could have looked a little bit further to the north, that the plane, maybe if it had dilly-dallied before it made its final turn to the southern Indian Ocean, maybe it would have wound up a little bit further to the north. That's where they left it. They had run out of budget. They had run out of time. And they thought that the search was going to be over. Then the following year, Ocean Infinity, this little-known company at the time, came forward and offered to the Malaysian government to search more on their own dime and only to be paid if they found it. So this was the second seabed search that took place in 2018. And they basically picked up the ball from the Australian authorities, and they did look further north. They looked further out from the seventh arc in that northern area, and they looked way further north along the seventh arc, along some parts of the seventh arc that really were statistically very unlikely, but it was their money. They could do what they wanted. They didn't find the plane, and they too eventually gave up. The first search had done 120,000 square kilometers. The second search had done about the same. They had searched an area that was about the size of Great Britain. The plane was not there. They called off their efforts too. And now at this point, by the end of 2018, 2 seabed searches, both unsuccessful, and really no more ideas. At this point, the way Malaysia left it was, look, unless we have really compelling new evidence of where to look, we're not going to authorize any more new searches. There's just no reason to look anywhere in particular. So if someone comes forward with new and compelling evidence, then we will consider authorizing a search. Well, that has not happened. There is no new evidence per se, but various independent researchers have been looking at the data, and among other things, they've been wondering, well, what other sources of information do we have? What else do we know that using the principles of Bayesian inference, we can update the probability distribution to maybe give us a new high probability search area? Well, one source of information is drift modeling, studying how ocean currents have historically carried drifter buoys around in the Indian Ocean, and comparing that to where pieces of MH370 washed ashore in the western part of the Indian Ocean starting in 2015. If you look at that drift modeling data, an interesting pattern emerges. There's a kind of a sweet spot around 35 degrees south. If the plane crashed further south from there, you'd expect that some of the debris would wash ashore in Australia, and none ever did. And if the plane crashed further north from there, you'd expect debris to have washed ashore starting sooner than it actually did. So this is what Victor Iannello calls his sweet spot for where he thinks the plane might have gone. And he put forward a paper, and he has elaborated that on his website since. Okay, but this area, this sweet spot that Victor pointed out, has already been searched on 2 separate occasions. So why go back? Well, the reason it still might be there is that there's some very rugged underwater terrain around there. And if you think about how side scan sonar works, it's basically a bit like ultrasound. You're sending out high frequency sound waves in a kind of spotlight pattern, and you're measuring the reflections in order to generate a 3D picture. It's a bit like shining a flashlight, really. And you can imagine if you're walking through a rough desert and there's boulders and ravines and things, you can imagine you're shining your light, and maybe, the thing you're looking for is like stashed behind a boulder, or it's stuck in a hole or something. And so the beam of light you're sending out isn't going to hit it, so you're not going to see it. So the idea is that the new round of searching will go back to these areas where there's a lot of rough terrain and look at it from different angles or a little closer up. It's using new technology. Maybe it will be able to get around those problems in other ways that I don't even understand. But somehow we're going to go back to these rough areas and see if the wreckage didn't just by sheer bad luck get stuck in a way that we couldn't see it before. In fact, right now, based on the latest position information that Kevin Rupp is reporting, it looks like the ship is parked right over an underwater canyon that had only been partially searched before. Another possibility is the plane might have wound up further from the seventh arc, meaning that after sending its last transmission, it might have somehow glided further from that location and gotten further out away from the seventh arc. This is pretty unlikely, but it will round out the last of the possibilities for the plane could have gone. Now, all of this logic is eminently sensible, but until today, we didn't know that that was the actual logic that Ocean Infinity was planning to follow. Now we do. What is going on is that Armada 7806 has pulled up to the seventh arc at 34.6286 degrees of latitude south, and this is pretty close to an area of rough underwater terrain that was specified by Victor Iannello. So this seems to be the logic of the current search. If you're 100% convinced that the plane went into the ocean and that the data wasn't tampered with, then it simply has to be there. This is the most likely place for it to be. This is why they're only planning to search 15,000 square kilometers. There's just no basis for thinking it's anywhere else. Which leads to a really interesting question. What if it's not there? What if they search this 15,000 square kilometers and the plane is not there. Definitively, for sure, not there. You might be tempted to say, well, that would just be super unlucky, but really luck has nothing to do with it. Actually, a failure to find the plane would be strong positive evidence that tells you something important. It tells you that your analysis was wrong. And realizing that your analysis was wrong can open the door to a new analysis that is correct. Okay, but how could it be wrong? For me, there's a major assumption that search officials have made that I think is much shakier than they realize. And this is their fundamental assumption that the data could not have been tampered with. It must have been generated innocently as a result of processes that weren't altered or manipulated in any way. But in fact, if you look at where the data comes from, this isn't such a slam dunk assumption at all. You see, when MH370 vanished, it was in an electrical configuration that no plane has ever been in before or since. Starting about 40 minutes after takeoff, someone on board the plane switched off all of the electronic communication systems. The goal was evidently to make the plane go dark on air traffic control screens so that no one would see that it had pulled a 180 and was flying back over the Malaysian peninsula and then made good its escape over the subsequent 6 hours. The really weird thing is that an hour later, one of the systems was turned back on. The satellite communications link that connected the plane to Inmarsat. This box got turned back on, and it subsequently produced the data that scientists used to generate the probability distribution. Because its captain, Zaharie Ahmad Shah, was locked into the cockpit at the time, the authorities have always assumed that he was the one who did this, as part of a plan to commit mass murder-suicide by flying the plane off into the remote southern Indian Ocean. Here's the thing. No one has ever come up with a good explanation for why Zaharie would do such a thing. There have been various scenarios that people have proposed, but none of them make actual sense when you stop and pick through them. There's simply no reason why an airline pilot would turn this box off and back on again, even in the context of a desire to commit suicide. Over the years, I've talked to a lot of 777 pilots about the circumstances under which they might want to turn this box off and back on again. They all say it doesn't make any sense. I asked Juan Brown about it.
You do not, under any circumstances, go messing about with these switches until you are directed to by an emergency procedure. Never had to mess with the electrical system at all in all the years of flying the 777.
I asked Ron Rogers about it.
It's an extremely complex system with a level of depth that is way beyond what a pilot needs to know and what they're typically trained. I mean, you got to be in the engineering. So to specifically say, I am going to disable this system, I would be very interested in knowing how that person figured out for sure. It doesn't make it easy for you to do that.
Most recently, I asked John Waters of the Afterburn podcast about it.
I have no idea, like how I would isolate the STU. Maybe it is a circuit breaker and it's right over my head and I can find it, pull it, and it shuts it off.
The take-home lesson for me is that for a decade now, the authorities have just assumed that the captain, for whatever reason, figured out how to turn the box off and back on again and had some reason to do that. And as a result, the data was generated in a way that Zaharie couldn't have foreseen and so couldn't have altered. But to me, given all of the things that these 777 pilots are telling me, it's extremely weird that this data exists at all in the form that it does. And we should really be treating it with a very high probability that it was tampered with. And if the seabed search that's going on right now, the third seabed search, comes up empty, I think we have really yet more powerful evidence that this is exactly what happened. That the reason that the seabed searches keep finding only empty seabed is that the plane isn't on the seabed. And it's not on the seabed because their analysis was wrong. And the reason their analysis was wrong was that they made a faulty assumption. And the faulty assumption was that the data couldn't possibly have been tampered with. When in fact, there's every reason to believe that the evidence was tampered with. And once everyone acknowledges that as a key fact about MH370, we can finally get on with solving the case. Okay, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Ocean Infinity is on the case. They have a vessel over the new high probability search area. Hopefully, they will find MH370 in the next week or two. It will all be done and dusted. This case will finally be solved, and the relatives of the missing will have answers, and so will the rest of us. But if they don't, it's not terrible, because we will have really strong evidence for taking a whole new approach to the mystery.